So I've come along to Test Lane at Redbridge near Southampton this morning, and I'm going to talk about my grandparents, Fred and Ellen Mitchell, and they lived 100 years ago. They were living in a house here. Well, they had a flat in an old house called Test House. This is Test Lane. And they lived in I'd say a flat in Test House. I think Test House was a big house. It must have been an estate and that, like they used to be, but it was by then split into flats. And just opposite here is it's a line of lime trees opposite there, and that is where this just here. This is where, just let this car go by. This is where the drive was to the house. And I spoke to my Uncle Phil about this, and I said to him, it would get busy. There's been hardly any cars up to now, as typical, isn't it? So I said to my Uncle Phil, before he died, I had a few chats with him, and I said to him about where actually was the house in Test Lane. He said, there's a line of lime trees, and he said that was the drive, that lined the drive up to the house. And I used to work at the Echo office, you see, which is just here, and it's all gone now. But I used to work there for the last 10 years of my working life. I used to work there, and I said, well, that's at the entrance to the Echo office. And he said, well, that's where the house was. So there we are. So what we're going to do today is just have a look at round here and how my grandparents, oh, I can't believe it. There's been hardly any cars since I arrived. Right, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to get away from this road, okay? I'll tell you all about it. So I've just come out today this is Test Valley Nature Reserve. It's over at Redbridge in Southampton. And as I said, this is where my grandparents moved to. I don't know exactly when it was. I'll tell you the story about my granddad and that. So my granddad, he's Fred Mitchell, and he was born in 1880 in Leeds. He was a Yorkshireman. And he was born in a little place called Farsley, which is just on sort of on the outskirts of Leeds. And you've got Farsley, Pudsey, and then going back further into the family, there's a place called Driglington, and they lived there going back a little bit further than 1880, going back to the early 1800s. The family lived in this place, Driglington, and they used to work in the mills. They were all mill workers, all my family, the Mitchells, up in Leeds. So my granddad, born in 1880, and he grew up there, but instead of going into the mills like all his family did, he and a couple of his brothers as well, they became what they called steam fitters. So they were engineers, and it can seem a bit odd as to why, because they worked on ships and that, which can seem a bit odd seeing as they lived in Leeds, which is nowhere near the sea. But I think probably that time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, probably shipbuilding, ship repair with the Empire and everything, the Navy. So there was a lot of work, I presume, and I imagine there was a bit of money about, and that they were paid quite well. So I assume that's why they did it. Anyway, they did. And so what he did, he used to work in a gang of men who they worked around the naval dockyards, and there was a gang of them. And the first time I come across them, I can really only trace this through what I've been told by family members, and also looking at the censuses. Is it censuses? And so he was working, his brother Arthur, his older brother Arthur, was also there. So they were in this gang of men, and that's what they were. They were civilians, but they worked around the naval dockyards, working on the naval ships. And so that was that. And in 1911, and this is from the 1911 census, he was in Plymouth. And so he is in a boarding house in Plymouth with a gang of men, and his younger brother Bert is with him. His older brother Arthur, he seems to have disappeared. And I believe that Arthur could have emigrated to Australia, but I've got no sort of definite information on that. But from what I sort of understand is that Arthur emigrated to Australia, but I don't know anything about that. I don't know when. So Fred and his brother Bert, they're in this gang of men staying in Leeds, and while he was there, he got to know a local girl who was of the Westcott family. Her name was Ellen Westcott, and the Westcotts, they're quite a big family, I believe, and they worked in the docks. You got Devonport, there you got Plymouth, and Devonport was the dock area. Stonehouse, they lived in Stonehouse, and that's sort of the dock area, and it was the sort of poorer area of the city by the docks, and that's where they lived. And she was a laundress. She worked in a laundry, I think not far from where they lived. Oh, there's another train going by. It's, if you forget how busy this line is. So he got to know Ellen Westcott, apparently, and they evidently got on. They got on quite well, because when he moved on to the next job, she went with him. You see, and so the next thing is that my uncle Bert, he was born in 1912 to Fred and Ellen, and that was in Portsmouth. He was born in Portsmouth. So my grandfather, he had moved down to Portsmouth to the next job, and Ellen had gone with him. And hence my Uncle Bert was born. Now, my Uncle Bert was called Bert, apparently after my granddad's brother, Bert, who, as I say, was his younger brother. And apparently they were very close. The two of them were very close. And so Fred called his first son Bert after his brother, which was nice. So evidently what happened was Fred went off to Portsmouth, Ellen went with him. She possibly was pregnant at the time, and they arrived in Portsmouth as Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, and had set up together. And I can't find any reference to a marriage. They never got married, but as I say, they obviously arrived at the next port, and they came there as Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, and they evidently never bothered to get married. And so that was that. And the next thing which happened was my dad was coming along. That was 1915. He was born in March 1915. And so putting two and two together, I think my grandmother had probably got a bit fed up with them moving around the dockyards and living in boarding houses with a child. And there's another one on the way now. So putting two and two together, you think, I think she obviously got a bit fed up with this. So she was going to go back to Plymouth to have the baby, which would become my dad. And she had actually decided that she wasn't going to keep the baby. I got this from my mum. And so one of her sisters, they were a big family. They most of them were in those days. And so one of her sisters was going to have the baby and look after it. So my grandmother went back to Plymouth to her family, had the baby, and of course she couldn't, came to it and she couldn't give him up. So she kept him. And at some point also, apparently she went up to and stayed with my dad's family in Leeds. But I think she was getting a bit fed up with the moving about. So what happened next was they moved to Southampton, and that was in 1917. And they moved to Foundry Lane in Southampton. And I don't know how long they were there for, but shortly after, it must have been around the end of the First World War, they moved here, as I said earlier, to Test Lane. And it was Test House, which was a big house. It must have been an estate and that. And it was split into flats then. And so they had a flat there. And that's where they lived. And that's where they lived for many years. So that's how they came to be living in Southampton and here at Test House. And lovely. So they had the two children, the two boys, and then they had a daughter. That's my Aunt Jen, and she was born in 1917, I think. And finally they had a fourth, which was another boy, my Uncle Phil, who was, I believe, born in 1922. So there was the four of them, and this is where they were. This, which has become, as I say, Test Valley Nature Reserve. It's I imagine identical to how it was when they were here, and this is where they played, and that's so lovely. And also, when I was young, I got an interest in the family history and where they'd all come from. So what I did, of course, I talked to aunts and uncles and everyone to get as much information as I could. And so I said about, of course, you want dates when my granddad's birthday was, when all dates when things happened. And it was funny because there was one day all my aunts and uncles were around. And I said about it, and about their dad's, my granddad's birthday, and they didn't know it. And so all I know is that he was born in 1880, but I don't know when. And they didn't know his birthday. And I thought that was a little bit strange. I find that a bit strange because everybody knows their parents, well, most people, I think, know their parents' birthday. Because, of course, you give them presents and that, and you have some sort of celebration or whatever. But I think most people know their parents' birthday. So that seems a little bit strange. It's one or two things like that which just, I wonder if there's something in his background that he sort of kept quiet about and didn't want anyone to know about. But anyway, that's by the by. There is another thing about him as well. This came mainly from my mum, and that's that he played the piano, and he played classical piano, and apparently he was a bit of a child prodigy, and he played in a big hall in Leeds when he was quite young. But that's all I know. That just comes from my mum. But when I had a few chats with my Uncle Phil before he died, and I said to him about this. I said about your dad, is that right that he played the piano? And he said yes. He said that's true. He said we had a piano at home and he used to play it, but he used to play classical piano. And he said he wouldn't he wouldn't play in the pubs. And that. He used to frequent the pubs. Apparently there were 4 pubs around here, so my Uncle Phil said, and I think they might be down to 1 now. But there was, I think it's the Anchor just down the road, but I think the Anchor may be closed now. But I think the main pub, which my granddad used to drink in, I think that's gone. But apparently there were 4 pubs, but that's nothing unusual in an area like this back 100 years ago. So yeah, he said his dad wouldn't play in the pubs, and he played classical piano. And I'll never really find out the story of that, because they don't really sort of strike me as a sort of family who would produce a child prodigy who played the piano. But obviously he learnt this, so there's a bit of a story there somewhere. But he never carried it on, only to sort of play at home. Uncle Phil said, yeah, he used to play at home, but that's all he did with it. So that's a little bit odd, isn't it? I don't know. There's obviously a little bit more to these stories, but as I say, I don't see how I could ever find out about it. But that's a little bit about my granddad, anyway. So there we are. I've done the preamble. I've set the scene, explained to you about my grandparents, how they got to be living in Southampton here in Test Lane. So we're up now to 1932. This is a point of what we've come here for. 1932, the 18th of November. And my grandmother, she hadn't been home for quite a while, apparently. So she was going to go home. She was going to go and catch the bus down to see her family back in Plymouth. And so my granddad, he used to come out here shooting. They all did. And my dad was quite a good shot, apparently. So they had shotgun and that, and they all used to do a bit of shooting, and so he used to come over here. So that's what used to happen. So my granddad said to my grandmother, he would come out here and get a couple of ducks, shoot a couple of ducks, for her to take to her family, which is what happened. So he came out, and my grandmother was over in the kitchen, and she heard a couple of shots. This is my Uncle Phil told me this. So she heard a couple of shots, and then there was a loud shot which was closer to the house. And what had happened was that my granddad was coming back now, and he was somewhere around here. Of course, everything exactly the same as it is now. The railway line was here, exactly the same. So he was coming back. In fact, I don't think this has changed, really. This fence, I don't think this has changed, because I can remember back in the 60s and that it was exactly the same as this. I think this fence is probably pretty much how it was when what I'm going to tell you happened. So he got back, he's got to get through the fence, he's got to get across and across the road, across the railway track, across the road. So what he does, he gets here and he puts the gun through the fence. Now, he puts it through the fence with the barrel pointing back towards him. This is where it all goes wrong. So he had a habit, oh God, there's a train coming by the sound of it. Right, it's going to be a bit loud here, so I'll shut up while the train, we'll just wave to the train as it goes by. Oh, it's all right, that was only a little one, 2 carriages. Right, so he gets it. Now, he had a habit of not putting the safety catch on the gun. It was a double-barreled shotgun, apparently, 12-bore. And he had a habit of not putting the safety catch on. I think he was the type of chap who didn't like to obey rules, and that. My dad was exactly the same. And so what happened, he put the gun through, pointed back towards him. The trigger must have caught something there, and basically the gun went off. And it was pointing back towards his shoulder, went off, both barrels went off, nearly blew his arm, into his shoulder, nearly blew his arm off. Absolutely dreadful. So that's what had happened. That was the loud shot which my grandmother heard. And so she came out from the house, and of course my granddad was in a terrible state. He was shouting and that, and he was in a terrible state, of course, losing a lot of blood. Apparently he was wearing waders which were full of blood. So there's there was another family lived there as well. They had another flat, and they were called the Aylings. And so my grandmother and Mrs. Ayling, they came out, found my granddad terrible. So they helped him back to the into the house, into the kitchen, and there's a small boy comes into this story, and he I think was one of the Aylings, and Uncle Phil seemed to think he was about 7. Of course, there was no telephones and that in those days. Well, not the ordinary people like them would have telephones, so they didn't have, not like it is now, of course. So this small boy, who is nameless, we don't know who he was, but as I say, he was apparently one of the Aylings. He was sent to run into Totton to the doctors and fetch doctor, which he did. He ran, it's probably a mile, I don't know, mile or a bit more than a mile into Totton. And so he ran in there, got the doctor came out in his car. He took my granddad to hospital, and I don't know which hospitals and that they were. And the general might have been there, but I don't know. So he was taken to hospital, and unfortunately his injuries were just too bad, and he died later on that day. My mum seemed to think that he had lasted a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, but that doesn't seem the case. He died on the 18th of November when it happened. So a dreadful thing. No, my dad and his uncle, my uncle Bert, his brother, they had apprenticeships. My dad, I think, was 17. My uncle Bert was 19. And they were apprentices at White's shipyard. That's where my granddad used to work. He used to work for White's shipyard in Southampton, and he'd only work for White's shipyard. And in those days, it was a little bit different. They used to work when work was available, but he would only work for White's apparently. But Southampton's always been a sort of busy port and that. And I think work was not a problem. Anyway, my dad and his brother Bert, they were apprentices. They were contacted. They came home from work. My Aunt Jen, I think she was at work. She was, I'm not sure to be honest, 14, something like that. And she was at work as well, apparently. She wasn't contacted till she came home. And my Uncle Phil was 9, he was at school. And so he didn't find out also until he came home from work. So a dreadful business. And so, of course, my grandmother, she was in her 40s, left with 4 children, difficult in those days. Not quite the same as it is. People didn't get looked after quite the same. But going back to the fact they weren't married, there was a thought, because it would be difficult, obviously, for her. So somebody said, well, you would get a pension. You must be entitled to a pension. And my grandmother was adamant that no, it was not to be investigated, that she would have a pension, which can seem a bit odd until you realise, of course, if they weren't married, she probably thought that it would come out that they weren't married and she wouldn't be entitled to a pension if they weren't married. So I presume that's what's that about. But she was a forthright. She was a tough lady, brought up in a tough place. So the outcome of this is that my Uncle Bert, he looked into it, because there must be something. So he looked into it, and my nan, apparently she was really angry. But anyway, he looked into it, and so a chap came out from the council, or whoever deals with that sort of thing. He came out and he said, yes, of course, Mrs. Mitchell is entitled to help and that. And it was looked into, and so she did get a pension or whatever they got. So she did get some help, but still, as I say, tough, especially back in those days. And with 4 children, tough. So there we are. That's the story. That's what I wanted to sort of put across. And that's what happened. And there we are. That's how they came to be in Test Lane here, living over in Southampton. And this is where my dad and his brothers and sister, this is where they grew up. So I will, before I sort of finish this little account of this, I'll just pop round to Nursling Church, because they weren't churchgoers. None of my family seemed to have been religious people, and I don't think there was much going to church. But the Nursling Church was the local church to where they were. And that's where they're buried, and that's where my aunts and uncles are buried. So I'll just pop round there and just show you around there. So there's a couple of stories that my uncle Phil, told me about being brought up in this area. He was younger than my dad. He was born in 1922, and my dad was born in 1915. But apparently, as one thing that happened, my dad and some of his friends, they were out here. Of course, this is the River Test here. The tide's quite high at the moment. And I don't know what they were. They weren't very old. To be honest, I don't know how old they were. But they were only boys. And they were here out on the river somewhere, messing about like boys do. And they had a door, an old door, which they were floating out onto the river. And one of the boys, he couldn't swim. So they were floating him out on this door. And the upshot of the story is that unfortunately he fell in, and even worse, he actually drowned. And Uncle Phil said that my dad never really got over this. As you can imagine, that the boys were unable to save him and that. So that's a little thing that happened. And there's another story that my Uncle Phil told me, and it happened just here. And this here, the tide's right in, so you can't really see it very well. But just over here, there's a big pipe, and you can just see the top of it there. There's a couple of other smaller ones just on the opposite there. And this pipe is big enough. Uncle Phil said that as small children, they used to walk up it as far as they could. And when you see it, it's big enough. You can see a small child, if you stoop down, would be able to walk up it. But apparently, again, my dad, he was apparently about 7, and he was here again with some friends, and again they were messing about. Now, if the water wasn't here, if the tide wasn't in, you'd see this is actually a concrete platform here, and it gets to the ends there, and it abruptly goes down. It's quite deep from there. And what happened is my dad got into trouble because he got into this deep bit, and he couldn't swim that well. As I say, he was only about 7 apparently, and so he got into serious trouble. And of course his friends, the boys, they were panicking and that, obviously shouting and that they couldn't get him. And going back, the Ayling family again, and Mr. Ayling, the house was only just over here, and Mr. Ayling, he came out and he fished my dad out and saved him. So there we are. I mean, these sorts of things happen, and of course did used to be back then, as possibly even more so, because of course the kids, they were pretty much just left to their own devices. They used to go off and play in here. A wonderful childhood, but of course fraught with risks like that, kids being kids. I was brought up from the age of 9. We were in the New Forest at Cadnam, Netley Marsh, and I was brought up there, and my experience out there was pretty similar to that just used to go off with a friend up in the fields, and that was it. We just left to our own devices, and we came back in the evening when we were hungry. And I don't think Mum wanted us around really, because she had her in the school holidays. She had her life and what she did, and so that's what we used to do: go off and just spend the day up climbing trees and making arrows and bows and arrows, spears, and hunting rabbits, and all these sorts of things that boys do. So, as I say, it can also, of course, be fraught with a bit of danger. So there we are. That's a couple of little stories that my Uncle Phil told me about growing up here. And apparently they had a boat. I don't know what sort of a boat it was. I imagine it as some boat with a little sail and that. But it's probably completely wrong. It was probably a rowing boat or something. I don't know. But I've got a very sort of Swallows and Amazons view of what it must be like. You probably wasn't anything like that at all. Oh, we've got a train coming along. That's nice. There we are. It's quite a well-used line, this one. There we are. Yeah, the train line's been there for a long time, of course. So there we are. That's a couple of stories, as I say, that my granddad told me about. Sorry, my Uncle Phil told me. So I've come along here to St Boniface Church at Nursling, and I'll just show you around here because, as I say, this is where my grandparents and a few of my aunts and uncles are buried. So here we go. So there's been a church here for a long time, and in fact the religious nature of the site goes back way back to almost back to Roman times, because they think that there was a monastery I think it was a monastery, something way back in early Saxon times, just after the Romans, and then the church was variously built after that. And it's St Boniface, and St Boniface. The only problem with this, actually, I will just say, the only problem with the church is the proximity. As you may be able to hear, unless the noise reduction is really good. The motorway is literally just 100 metres or so away there, and of course you've got the constant drone of the motorway, with the cars on the motorway. So that's the only problem. It's not exactly a peaceful place anymore, but I'm sure it was. Anyway, that's irrelevant. So Boniface, he was a monk, and he was here at the whatever it was monastery. And he was born in 600 and something. I'll put it on there. I'll look it up and put it on there. But he was born in 600 and something, and he was a monk here, and he seems to have been quite good at monking. And he went away on a mission, and he went to the Germans, and he went to convert the pagan Germans. And so he went off, and he seems to have done quite a good job, but he did get martyred in the end. I think he was in his 70s, but he did get martyred by the Germans. I think it was the Frisians, and he obviously upset them. They weren't too keen, perhaps, on what he was telling them. Anyway, so that was St Boniface, and apparently I was talking to someone in the church here once, and they said they still get Germans visiting quite regularly. They get Germans visiting to see where Boniface came from. So there we are. That's Boniface, but that's nothing to do with what I'm going to tell you about now, because this is the grave. This is my grandparents, and so here we have, and we got, in loving memory of our dear father Fred Mitchell, who passed away the 1st of November, the 18th of November, 1932, aged 51 years. Also, our dear mother Ellen, who passed away the 20th of September 1967, aged 81 years, reunited. So I think that stone was put up when my grandmother died in 1967. And this little one that's here, in loving memory of Fred Mitchell, passed away November the 18th, 1932. And let's just see, I don't know what that says under there. Oh, aged 51 years. There we are. And I think that's probably the original one. It's like shaped like a book. I think that's the original, what was put when my granddad died. So there we are. So that's my grandparents. That's where they are. So let's just have a little look around the churchyard here. It's just coming. We're just into March, and all the spring flowers are out, so it's quite nice. And there's a yew tree over there. Always get yew trees in these old churchyards, of course. So let's have a look. I like churchyards. It's funny, I'm not a religious person, but I do get churchyards. It's very peaceful. Don't get a lot of problems from the inhabitants. And they're all sort of nicely kept. And if it wasn't for the motorway, it would be really sort of peaceful and relaxing. But anyway, let's have a look here at one of the biggest yew trees that I've come across. Now, this yew tree is pretty impressive, and it is very old. It's probably in excess of 1,000 years old, possibly even more. And I have contacted the local church authorities to see if, when they're doing a bit of chopping on it, a bit of pruning, if I could have a piece of the wood, because I make pens, you see. I make artisan pens, and it would be nice to just make a couple from the wood from the churchyard here, from the old yew. So we'll see what happens about that. It's months ago I wrote to them. They did contact me and say that if they ever get round to it, they'll pass it on to the church warden or whoever organises these things. But there you are. It's certainly a magnificent tree. Okay, so we'll just have a walk through here, and I'll show you where other members of the family are as well. Here we are. This bit of sunshine and that's brought all the flowers out, and it's obviously brought a few people out to come and visit the graves, because there's lots of flowers in that here. In fact, it's lovely. So we're doing a come round here. And here we go. This is the first one. So this one is in loving memory of a dear wife, mother, grandmother and great-grandmother, Gwendolyn May Mitchell, who passed away 24th of June 2000, aged 73 years. Sleep well, my darling. Also of a dear husband, father, grandfather and great-grandfather, Philip Mitchell, who passed away 5th of April 2002, aged 79 years. Good night and God bless. My poor old uncle there, they had to cram all that in. They had to use smaller because they nearly used it all up doing from my Aunt Gwen. So that was my Aunt Gwen and my Uncle Phil. And they lived not far away from here. They lived on Millbrook Estate. And they were party people. My Aunt Gwen, Uncle Phil, they were really party people. And they used to love dancing and that. Apparently they used to do the jitterbug in the 1930s and that, but they used to jive and they loved all of that. And all my family, they all worked in the docks. My dad, my uncles, they all went, apart from Uncle Phil. And when I spoke to him when he was older and not long before he died, and he said no, he said that my dad got him an apprenticeship because my dad was his older brother, and he got him an apprenticeship and that. But Uncle Phil said it wasn't for him, and I said no, I was exactly the same. And so he became. He actually had a really nasty illness in the early 1960s. I'm not quite sure. It was something to do with really nasty arthritis. I don't know any details on that. But he was confined to a wheelchair at the end for a long time. He was very ill. So he became the steward at Nursling Club, not far from here. And that's when I sort of really remember. That's where I learned to play snooker. In the late 1960s, I used to come and play snooker with my dad. That's where I learned. Was at Nursling Club. And normally you couldn't play snooker till you were sort of 14 in those days, because snooker halls were not the sort of places that kids should be. And of course, for a number of reasons. One, of course, was that everybody smoked. And in fact, I can remember the old snooker halls back at that time in the 60s, early 70s, and at times where you couldn't see across the table barely for the cigarette smoke. Dreadful looking back on it now, but there you are. So that was that. He was the steward at Nursling Church, and then he took over as landlord at a pub near where I live. It's called the Miller's Pond. And he took that off. He was the landlord there. He was a good pub landlord and that. He loved that sort of life and that. And so he was good. It had been called the Railway Inn, and I think it had become a bit run down and a bit seedy. But he took it over. He ran it well, and they refurbed it right through, called it the Miller's Pond, and it's still there now. And then, of course, he got too old for that, so he handed it on to his son. He was also Phil. We called him Young Phil, as you can imagine. And so he took over as the landlord there. And I don't know too many details on that, but it didn't go very well. And I think he had a bit of a drink problem, which is not ideal as a pub landlord. And as I understand it, they got into a lot of financial difficulty in that. Anyway, the upshot was one day he just disappeared. I think he just put the keys through the letterbox one night and he vanished. And he went to Spain, and it all ended tragically, unfortunately, because he committed suicide in the end. He drowned himself. So that was all very sad, and that was my cousin Phil. Anyway, here we are. This is my other aunt and uncle, and so here we have, in loving memory of my darling wife, Jenny Wilcox, died 28th of October 1979. God bless. And IGV Bob Wilcox, died 29th of July 2016, reunited. So that's my Aunt Jen and my Uncle Bob. Now, Uncle Bob, I remember he was a lovely uncle, and I remember him, he was from the West Country, and his initials, IGV Wilcox, he had a very strange name. And well, his first name was Isaac, which isn't that strange. I've got a grandson called Isaac, but the other two names are very strange. I'll put them on here, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But I remember my Uncle Bob, lovely man. Now he was in the Second World War. He was out in Burma. He was a commando fighting the Japanese in the Burmese jungle. And he was a tough man. He worked in the docks after the war. He worked in the docks. Hard men they were, tough man. But I always remember him being a lovely uncle. And my Aunt Jen, yeah, she was very typical of the Mitchells. That a very jolly sort of person, Aunt Jen, and very similar. They lived not far from Aunt Gwen and Uncle Phil. And they were all up for a party. And I remember when I was young, I remember great family parties, and Christmas was all a great thing to Aunt Jen. She used to save all year in a Christmas club. So that's my Aunt Jen and my Uncle Bob, and here they are. So yes, this is the church. This is the church then, Nursling Church, St Boniface. And as I say, my family, none of them, the Mitchells, the Westcotts, all of them, none of them were particularly church-going people. But for some reason, I was checking the church records here years ago when I was doing all the family history research, checking the church records here, and I came across 4 baptisms of the 4 children. My dad, my Uncle Bert, my Uncle Phil and my Aunt Jen. And they all got baptised here at the same time. And I can't remember when it was, but it's early 1920s, I think. So I suppose they had sort of settled into, this is where they were going to live, they'd settled into this community. And so they were just sort of getting things a bit organised. And that, I presume that was what that was about, because as I say, they weren't churchgoers or anything, but there we are. But I was 12 when my grandmother died, and hers was the first funeral that I'd been to, so it's really the first time I'd come into contact with death. And just before she died, I came across, or I was shown, the family Bible. And the family Bible, I'm just going to have a little sit down here and just contemplate life. So the family Bible is a huge, great thing. And so I was interested in it, that was the thing. And my gran died just after that. And so the family got together and sorted out her bits and everything, and they decided to give this Bible to me, because I think they thought probably I was the only one who'd look after it, and they were right. I was absolutely delighted. As I say, a huge, great thing. And the cover was in a very, very poor state, but the inside of the book was okay, and it had a piece of paper in it. And it recorded this marriage of this couple. Who was Richard and Anne. They got married in 1795. And it records their first son, their first child, born in 1796. And he was James. And then it records 2 stillborn children. And that's it. There's nothing else. And so I was interested to know, first of all, who this couple were, because their name, I interpreted, reading it, that it was Theys, Thays. And so I spent years and years trying to track this Thays family, with no luck at all, to find out how the Bible, even if it did belong in the family, I didn't know who this couple were. So this all came to a head in 1998. I had a nasty illness and I couldn't work for the best part of a year. And I went down to Plymouth and to look into my grandmother, because it came through my grandmother's line, so to look into my grandmother's family. And so I found my grandmother. Her mother was Ellen Westcott. Her maiden name was Johns. So I got her, Eliza Johns, I got her birth certificate. She was born in 1855. Got her birth certificate. And so her mother on the birth certificate, her maiden name was Keys. So it just dawned on me, of course, this at the beginning of the writing on the piece of paper, the name was not TH, it was K. And it's just the funny way they used to write 200 years ago, all this elaborate writing. They'd split it, and anyway, it wasn't TH at all, it was K. The name was Keys, and I immediately traced it, found their record in Stoke Damrell Church, And so they were my fourth time great grandparents, and I put it all together, and there we are. So that's the story of that. So I think we're done. That's it. This is the church. This is where they all are. And that's really the end of this little story that I just wanted to tell you about. So I hope you've enjoyed that, me waffling on, and I'll catch you again on the next video.
Alone I spend another night. I close my book, I dim the light, I wait for sleep tonight.